I'm Blaine Mathieu. Welcome to Post-Industrial Voices, a new series from the Post-Industrial Institute featuring insights from thought leaders, business executives, and innovators shaping the future. In this episode, I have the honor to be speaking to Frode Odegard, the founder and CEO of the Institute and the key driver behind the summit that we held back in February 2026. Thank you, Frode, for joining me.
It's great to be here.
All right, let's dive right in. So now that the summit is behind us, I thought we'd take the opportunity to do a brief retrospective together. Now, you were obviously central to the summit, although you weren't on every panel, but you were there for the full event and had visibility across the whole thing, and of course, worked to plan it. What I'd love to do today is not to recap every session, but just to pull some of the big themes out and why they matter. So maybe to start with, step back, look at the summit as a whole. What most struck you about the feel of the conversations that we had over the 2 days?
Well, what's striking about every summit that we do is how we start out with an ambitious theme, which this time was autonomous organizations. And then we divide that into smaller conversations. We spend a couple of days looking at various aspects of the theme. And then by the end of the summit, we're sort of putting together the pieces. And what was interesting to see at this summit, I think, was the energy level certainly it's not getting any smaller or lower, and people are genuinely excited about how this is going to reshape the world. It's not just about building companies, even though I think that's heroic in itself, but it's really people are starting to see some of the bigger picture implications that all of this is going to have. And this is not about, as some people would portray it, Silicon Valley is doing this to the rest of the world, right? Or big tech is doing this to the rest of the world. This is really, in many ways, a bottom-up revolution. So you have knowledge about how to use computation to simulate better and better intelligence, and in many cases surpass human intelligence. And this is knowledge which is now quite widespread. So, of course, big tech has advantages in terms of having infrastructure and brand and economic resources and so on. But then you see a tremendous amount of funding going to new companies. They are leveraging AI to make a big dent in a variety of industries. So I still think about this as a bottom-up revolution in many ways.
Yeah, I think we're definitely seeing that. And obviously, a lot of the buzz around agentic AI related to OpenClaw is all about individuals making use of these technologies and then, in some cases, sneaking them into organizations, but very much a bottom up initiative. So, a lot of people are talking about bringing agents into organizations, and as you said, it's sort of a bottoms up initiative in many cases. Uh, some people listening might think this is really all futuristic talk and it's nothing is really happening in the real world today. But I was convinced by the summit that these shifts, this mindset, and the use of these technologies is absolutely already underway. How would you describe where we are actually right now with the use of these agentic technologies to drive autonomous organizations?
I think it depends on who you ask. There's a very different perspective coming from people who are in the enterprise, trying to deploy this, facing both some technology challenges, issues with integrating with legacy systems, data quality issues, cultural resistance to change, which is always the case in large organizations and even smaller organizations when you try to make radical change. And then you have the perspective of the people building new platforms, building new technologies. And we had a conversation yesterday we went to visit our speaker from NVIDIA, who was at the summit, and he sort of confirmed our perspective that the gap between what this technology can do and what enterprises are easily able to deploy is increasing. So that contrast between here's what's possible to build and here's what can be robustly deployed. And I'm not saying this is not just in people's heads. I mean, there are significant challenges, but that gap is getting bigger, and that contrast is something that permeated the conversations at the summit, I think.
What do you think are some of the implications of that gap continuing to widen? The fact that the technology is in large part already here, but the organizations aren't there, and as you said, the gap between those two is widening. What does
Yeah.
what result in?
Well, so that um, so you have to look at the causes for the gap and whether these obstacles are surmountable for enterprises. And then you have to look at what will happen to enterprises that are too slow to surmount those challenges. And I think initially it's certainly can be said that there are aspects of the technology itself, that still needs work. And people are still concerned about privacy. Um, People are still concerned about governance. They're concerned about liability and risks and all of that. The good news is that we are actually making progress in those fields, right? So monitoring agents. So we have the CEO of Wayfound joining us, um,
Right.
or using even cryptography solutions. So we have the CEO from Opaque joining us at the summit. All of these different aspects are being worked on, and so I'm very optimistic that on the technology side, more and more of the issues on the from suppliers, if you will, from technology suppliers, will be ironed out in the relatively near future. When you look at the consumer side, if you will, if you look at the enterprises that are trying to deploy this technology, they have a variety of challenges that are not so easily overcome in many instances. So you have for large enterprises, more than mid-sized, you have a lot of custom software development that's been done over the years, and they carry a significant maintenance burden for all of that software, which is operationally critical. So they can't really work well without it. Then you have cultural resistance and you have AI literacy among executives. And if you're talking about a company with 100,000 employees, that's many layers of executives. Um, and where they first look, I think, is where they can have productivity improvements, efficiencies, something that can be quantified, within the KPIs that they're already using. Beyond that, then you run into maybe the biggest issue, uh, which is lack of imagination about what the enterprise could be or what the industry could be. And there, it's easier for an outsider to come in, and I think within 5 years you're going to see this Amazon effect with a lot of these industry leaders and mature industries, where it's easier than ever before to stand up new technology products. Um, there's going to be a whole new generation of SaaS offerings, which are not going to be like yesterday's SaaS companies. That will be AI first companies, right? And a lot of these industry leaders today are sitting ducks. So they have a clock that's basically ticking down. Um, and yeah, if they don't get this fixed, then that's going to be it for them. So
So it sounds like you're saying this gap that you're talking about between the technology and organizational readiness is partly about imagination, understanding what potential uses and use cases could be, partly about understanding and having some proven ROI. Uh, I think my hypothesis is, of course, that's all true, Frodo, but I also see the technology itself is still not quite at the stage where despite vibe coding and all of that, to actually set up powerful, useful systems with agentic AI requires still quite a bit of technical
yeah,
expertise in the use of these technologies. And it's not the point yet where the business side, you might say, of the organization is able to just spin this up as easily as they might hire another person. Do you think that's also maybe contributing to why there's a gap between the use and the technology?
yeah, yeah. So of course, yeah. So there is a learning gap, right? So I mentioned AI literacy. There's a capability gap there. And if you look at what's happening in the management consulting industry, there's a rapid increase in the use of agentic AI, right? And so, and I think what's going to happen within these enterprises is that the all of the tasks involved in in uh, in effectuating organizational transformation are themselves going to utilize AI agents. So we shouldn't think of organizational transformation as some human-only activities where the humans are sort of operating on the enterprise, right? That's sort of the patient model, and now the enterprise can be woken up again, and he will leave it better. It's a messy process, and it's done by the people working within and leading the organization today, and so they will be using these tools as well. And
Right.
so that's kind of the good news here, is that will accelerate organizational transformation, right? So if you think about figuring out um, the degree to which your employees are knowledgeable, if they buy into the new way of doing business that's emerging, the degree to which executives are able to cope with this, you can use AI agents to accelerate the process of discovery there, to do assessments to figure out where you are. But certainly, you will also use the AI agents to accelerate the implementation. Yeah, so I think that's going to be for the large organizations that are slow to adapt. That's basically going to be their only hope. They can't do this with humans alone. They're going to be too far behind. And so that in itself now will be an opportunity for new startups, right? That will build platforms to help large organizations transform.
I want to click into that a little more though. So what will be the only hope of these larger organizations that are falling behind? What's
It's
their only
using
hope?
it's using agents to accelerate the work that they're slow to do
Hmm.
now in terms of transformation.
So
So
does this
transformation
mean
itself is just more
sort of
knowledge, right? So
so does this mean that, the early adopters in enterprise have been using chatbots and prompt engineering for a few years now to try to improve the productivity of their knowledge workers? It sounds like you're thinking that agentic AI will allow maybe some of the latecomers to almost skip the first generation, which
it's
they
not,
were late
yeah,
in,
I
and
wouldn't
they're
say
going to jump right to intelligent agents. Is that possible?
I wouldn't say skip, but what I would say is it will help them. It will give them the opportunity to catch up somewhat. How much I can't tell you, but if you think about you take an automotive manufacturer, right, and you compare that to sort of a large Silicon Valley tech company, and you can see the circumstances that they're dealing with in terms of legacy systems, union relationships, a certain kind of mindset that goes back decades. Some of that will require some of that you can't really use agents to help with. Like if you want to change people's mindset, you have to orchestrate conversations. You have to make the hard choices about who you're going to let go of or how to divest certain business units and so on. But when it comes to um, organizing the work for determining what legacy systems you have, what data is where, what business rules exist, all of that preparatory work, certainly you can use AI agents for.
Hmm.
Changing people's minds, that's still
Yeah.
a human leadership challenge, right?
Well, that's a really interesting hypothesis, and out of all the reading and immersion I've been in this notion of agentic AI in the last 6 months, I have to say it's the first I've ever heard this notion that the laggards, the later adopters, might be able to use agentic AI sort of to catch up. And it's interesting because we see a lot of examples like this in previous technology revolutions where laggards in an area of technology are able to, as you said, not necessarily skip that layer, but move right to another one which is more effective. Look at the wireline infrastructure in Africa, which was never built out because they just went right to wireless, right?
Yeah.
And I'd never thought about the use of AI and agentic AI in a comparable fashion, but that's really, really interesting thought, Frodo.
Well, operating executives focus on operating the business, right? And if you're a product development executive, you're focusing on developing new products. Someone has to focus on evolving, transforming the business. And in a lot of enterprises, that is not something, I mean, there's a lot of talk, but that is in terms of actuality, that's not something that someone is dedicated to doing on an ongoing basis. That responsibility is typically shared among people in the executive team and in the strategy committee and so on. And But if you analyze that work, it's just knowledge work.
Yep. Yep.
So if you can
Well,
accelerate other kinds of knowledge work, why not this? So that's what I think is going.
hmm. Well, and speaking of knowledge work and knowledge workers, I wouldn't want to mislead people into thinking this was purely a technology summit and discussion, because while, of course, there's an overlay of technology and AI and agentic AI on top of everything, a lot of the discussion in the summit was actually about people and about leadership. What were some of the highlights or thoughts that came through most strongly to you from those discussions?
Well, I was actually on that phone, so I can speak about that in more detail.
You were.
So, uh, so if you go back to Edwin Luck's definition of leadership as an ongoing process of inducing others to pursue a common goal or a vision, then uh, what AI and AI agents do is they change several things. We already have had uh, decreasing job tenures. That's been going on for a little while. And I think the most extreme number we found in our research was, this is from a few years ago, where the average tenure in large Silicon Valley tech companies is 2.1 years. The average job tenure for startups is 10.8 months. So the whole idea of leaders like developing people over time, right? That's that's become more of a fantasy than reality, right? And
Right.
so on the other hand, as a leader, if you purely have a transactional relationship with the people you lead, you're not going to build the trust that's necessary to implement a significant change in the organization. So leaders have to find a middle path. And the aspect of leadership that I think is in dire need of more attention is visioning. What is that new destination, this new common vision that we're moving towards? And there's a lot of uncertainty there. And it's an uncomfortable place to be, because as a senior executive, you're expected to have a good answer to that question. But not everyone knows that it's not as certain anymore, right? We all can sense that there are changes happening within our own organization, with customers, customers. So this becomes a significant challenge. So the relationship between leaders and employees um, is something that needs to be looked at very carefully. And you can't just find fancier ways of persuading people or inducing people to pursue that joint destination unless you have good destination that's attractive. So
Oh, but how is it possible for a leader to be effective, especially in the category of vision, when people feel helpless to even figure out what 6 months from now is going to look like?
yeah.
How, what does a leader do with that?
So how do you lead people into the unknown? Yeah,
Yes,
it's really
a
the
good way to put it.
so what I always said to CEOs is, don't feel like you have to be in charge of having all the answers. Take responsibility for there being a process to find the answers on an ongoing basis. Uh,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
the faster the outside world develops, and the more uncertainty and more chaos there is, the more you need help as a leader. You need
Yep.
more, you need more sensors, you need more tentacles, you need more antennas, whatever the appropriate expression is, uh,
Yep.
for people to be out there to give you feedback. You need to spend more time outside the organization talking to people, I think more than ever. And at the same time, you don't want to feel like you don't want people to feel like they're being abandoned. That's one of the problems with a leader, is too outward focused, right? So you have to find the balance. You have to come back, and also you have to come back and brief them what you found. And you should do the reverse too. You should send your own people out there, which is of course happening. People are being sent to conferences. They come back. They have to do presentations and so on. We just have to do more of that on a more frequent basis, spending a larger percentage of our time on that than we ever had to before as leaders, I think.
I
So,
couldn't agree more. Like the 2 days I spent at the summit were just, I took pages of notes listening to people talk. the things that I knew I had to think about more, take as leadership lessons, implementing with organizations I'm working with. I don't think I've ever been at a summit with that much information, and I think it's and value. And it's not just because of the summit that you designed, Frodo, but it's also, as you said, the speed with which this whole space is evolving is moving far faster than ever before. Whereas, you might have got two or three interesting ideas or things to work on at a previous summit. Now you got 10 or 20
Yeah.
because of
Yeah.
the pace, right?
Well, we've always, for these summits, we've always been, uh, about 18, 24 months ahead of where
Mm.
Main Street practices. And what's always interesting to me is to see what happens after a summit, where you see like what are people saying? What are the speakers we had? What are they saying 2 or 3 months later? Or how is that thinking continuing? And usually it validates the trajectory, right? So autonomous organization says that's not a reality yet, but the vector, the trajectory is very clear that that's where we're heading. And so in various areas at the summit, whether it's um, um, customer success, um, customer acquisition, product development, venture development, in all the conversations we were talking about, how are we doing in terms of moving towards increasing autonomy for AI agents, that is. And one phenomenon that you see now as well, and I have a paper in the works about this, but I'm not promising a ship date, but and it's I refer to it as a bottom-up economy. Um, and so if you think about so 3 years ago at our first summit, now we're leading up to our first summit, there was a lot of conversation around AI as a AI transformation as a bottom-up phenomenon in organizations. And executives felt like employees were ahead of them using these tools. A lot of executives were concerned about what would happen if employees use these tools and maybe even develop software using generative AI. And you had some awkward cases like Canada Airlines that had a customer support bot that promised a fantastic deal, and then they were actually taken. They actually lost in court. They had to honor that discount. Uh, and so then people started talking a lot about trust and governance with AI in the enterprise, and there was a lot of concern, and there still is concern about that. But the technology has developed, and there's still a tremendous amount of use, increasing use, of course, on the consumer side and in the home of every enterprise employee who are getting their own work done, organizing family events or their kids using it for homework and so forth. So that's just continuing. And in economics, there's a term, the informal economy, that refers to all the economic activity that happens outside of firms, like your teenage son mowing the lawn. This is not an investable economy, but it's there. And what we've also seen in the last 20 years is a dramatic increase in freelance work, generation after generation. So, and I think it was more than half of millennials doing either full time or part time freelancing. So, and if you talk to Gen Zers, having a side hustle, this is a normal thing. It just hasn't been an investable economy, and but increasingly it's becoming technology based. And now one of the things that we talked about at this summit, and actually the last summit as well, was AI agents as orchestrators at work. And when you think about what can be built without having to start a company, without having to formalize it, with AI agents and humans collaborating from the bottom up, um, there's some very significant economic opportunities there. And because of the nature of digital marketplaces, we'll be in a position where that economy could be investable. So that could be a whole new opportunity that opens up. So of course, it's going to be the AI version, the digital version of your teenage son mowing the lawn, right? It's going to be a new fashion company that can acquire anywhere in the world. We'll talk about tariffs here, but in the world can acquire manufacturing capacity, and where people are collaborating and also using AIs for fashion designs. And this is an online marketplace, and nobody went to raise funding. they were just able to build this from the bottom up because it was so inexpensive. The orchestration was inexpensive. And it used to be that we have to start companies and hire people to manage all of this work. And we don't have to do that anymore. We can just focus on the work itself. And that's kind of the one of the essential characteristics of autonomous organizations, right? Is we don't have to have 3 layers of management to get stuff done. The actual domain experts and the people doing the work can just focus on the work, and orchestration just becomes a service.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Well, so speaking of orchestration, and that leads me to think about governance. And there was a lot of serious discussion at the summit around topics like governance, trust, privacy, security, control of these systems. It certainly wasn't a discussion focused on move fast and break things and hope for the best. That was not the context. So, why do you think governance has become such a critical issue for autonomous organizations these days?
I think with the developments you mentioned earlier, people got a taste of what this would be like if there was no supervision whatsoever. And so suddenly
Right.
people became very interested in running this on a separate computer on a Mac Mini. And so yeah, so of course uh, we need a reliable, trustworthy orchestration, right? And so the purpose of governance is to ensure that orchestration that takes place is seeking to pursue appropriate goals with appropriate means, and that requires supervision. Um, in in organizations that are starting to utilize AI agents for both for orchestration and for productivity purposes, one of the discoveries that will be made is that this also provides a new opportunity for more in-depth governance using AI agents, not just looking at what AI agents are doing, but also looking at what humans are doing. So in that regard, AI agents can become a means to reducing risk in governance. And this is something I wrote about back in 2018 or something, a while ago. There was a paper on the use of AI in the boardroom, and the post-industrial transition and its implication for boards. And I advocated having an AI agent that's a board member with a vote. And one of the observations that I made was that boards have spent so much on their time on governance and risk reduction work, right? And on supervision of what the management team is doing. And AI agents can help free humans from doing a lot of that work so boards can become more creative again and do what they used to do before Starbucks and all of these scandals, right? Where boards actually functions kind of as a think tank for management, right? Where you could get advice and you had constructive discussions, and it was not just about covering your behind. Uh, so
That brings the thought to mind, Frodo, though, will people want to be governed by AI agents?
I think I think it's going to be a coexistence in that regard. And I'm not saying this as an advocate for giving uh, uh, political rights to AI agents or anything like that. But if you look at what's happened already in business history, in the recent business history, right? We have people who have worked gotten work through marketplaces like Upwork or Uber, where the allocation and the connection between the provider of the service, of the labor, if you will, is an AI, right? And on the other side, there's a human. So there's a matchmaker function, right? That's being performed. And if you were an Uber driver from the very start, your boss was an AI, basically, right? Not a fancy one, but the boss would tell you where to go. So who do you have to talk to for like coaching and advice? There was no human manager, right? And people got used to working that way. Um, what's happening now, and I mentioned this in my keynotes at the summit, is you're going to have of these services. So there's a website I found that I introduced included in my keynote called Rent a Human. So if you're an AI agent and you need a human to pick up a package and carry it from address A to address B, And the question is, if you're that human, do you really care about who's paying you? So that's there's a whole informal economy that's based on people getting assignments like that, and they're fine with it.
Yep.
So, and maybe there's a human making a phone call asking you, can you come pick up that package and we'll pay you this much, right? But that human could be fulfilling an assignment from an AI agent. Can you call this person? And so the answer is you can't really know. So in supply chains, for physical goods, we have traceability, right? So it can be very important, whether it's to avoid leakage of sensitive intellectual property, or whether to avoid having food that goes bad, um, or maybe there are sanctions against a certain country, so you want to make sure that that critical parts and technology do not end up in their supply chains, or whether there's a technology that has components that you don't want to have end up in your supply chain, like when you have like Chinese chips ending up in U.S. defense products. That's probably not a good idea. If you're concerned about what they might do on the firmware level, right? But for services, we haven't really had that as much. And that's going to become more important now, because pretty much everything that we're going to do in the post-industrial economy is going to be through a value network, or we call it a value graph, of AI agents and humans knitted together across organizational boundaries, or maybe without needing formal organizations as such. And then we want to know, well, where does this content come from? And who is involved and who's being paid and all this stuff. So, and because of that, I think distributed ledgers will certainly become very popular again as a way of attaining some of that traceability and assurance. Um, so, with new risks, and I think we have to learn to manage both sides, right? That's just part of the game.
Yeah.
So.
Yes, for sure. Well, so Frodo, for somebody who didn't attend the summit and wasn't part of all of these discussions, but they're really serious, say senior executive trying to make sense of this moment and where we are with autonomous organizations, what would you most want them to understand or to take away?
Um, so, for the last 150 years at least, what's been clear is, so after the second industrial revolution, organizations that could create or utilize technology faster have had a strategic advantage. If you're more innovative, you will tend to do better. And that's not the only thing you have to do well. You also have to be able to execute. You have to hire good people. Everyone knows that. But the speed with which this next generation of technology, which are basically our tools that think for themselves, right, and help us think, the impact that that's going to have, and the speed with which that impact will be felt, is at a whole different level than what we've been used to. And so here, I think it's important for individual executives and leaders to dare to be uncomfortable and explore things that are outside of what they normally would read about, and really try to become hands-on with this technology. And I remember when the internet was new, I'm that old, and the commercial internet, and CEOs would sometimes appoint mentors to kind of help them learn how to use these
I
tools.
remember those days. Yep.
Yeah. Um, and I don't think that's a bad idea. I think if you have more of a personal experience, even if you don't have a technology background, I think it's going to be an essential source of ideas. It's going to really help you with your imagination, or what your organization could look like, and what your industry could look like. Because in the end, I think it's the imagination of leaders. When you think about visioning and having that idea what we could become, I think that is really the real bottleneck. The immediate implementation and logistics and all that stuff, your CIO will help with that. You can get consultants who will help with that, but no one can be a substitute for the imagination of where you're going. And to do that, you have to be a bit of a tourist, right? You have to kind of travel ahead of the rest of your organization a bit, or have other people help you travel ahead, look ahead. And that's becoming much more urgent now, I think.
I think you're right. Well, for people listening who find these topics interesting and compelling and important, maybe tell us a bit more about the Post-Industrial Forum, the Post-Industrial Institute, and what is it designed to do for them, and how can they stay engaged?
So I founded the Post-Industrial Institute, my goodness, almost 22 years ago now. So we have fairly deep experience with organizational redesign and transformation. Our mission is to develop new management science. So traditional management science is based on circumstances from after the Industrial Revolution, and some of the ideas go back to the Bronze Age, so pretty dated. The circumstances that are appearing now require us to think about organizations in new ways. And so what we do is we do that research and we develop courses. We do some advisory work, and we have a leadership forum, the Post-Industrial Forum, where we gather together leaders and domain experts who are shaping the future. So this experience that people have at the summit can be had on an ongoing basis. And the audience that we serve really are these leaders who are taking their organizations on a journey, right? They themselves are on a journey. They're going from industrial era thinking to post-industrial era thinking, and they have to learn about new technology, learn about AI. They have to learn about new management, modern management thinking, and the people who are the leaders who are motivated to develop themselves and also their organizations. Those are the people who come to us and that we help.
Makes perfect sense, and it's very clear that, the institute and the forum is dealing with issues that they're not far off, right? They're now. They're not niche issues. These are the big issues that many organizations, virtually all organizations, are dealing with: technology, leadership, governance, organizational design, right? All the stuff you've been talking about and you're an expert in. And for anyone who wants to stay close to these conversations and this leading edge knowledge, the Post-Industrial Forum, I know personally, is where that work continues. And everyone, please look for links nearby where this video appears on Frode. Thank you, Frode, for joining us today. Great conversation.
Yeah, my pleasure as always. Thank you.